segment, History of Artesia, with our director of the Artesia Historical Museum and Art Center, Mr. Michael Rebman. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
I hope everything's doing well at the old museum today.
Yes, things are quite well today.
Excellent, excellent. Do you want to start with our topic today, or do you want to start with the news on the website name? Where do you want to begin?
Well, there's quite a bit to talk about. I guess first we can mention that the information technology people over at City Hall gave us a shortened URL for the museum. So to visit the museum's website, it is now artesianm.gov/museum.
Great. So you don't have to type in words and hashes and dashes and numbers and all this other kind of stuff. So let's see, artesianm.gov/museum. Now, if I spell museum correct, that should work. Historical Museum and Art Center. It worked. So excellent. That'd be a quick way to get to the museum website. So, well, good. Well, let's. Last week, we talked drive-ins and the history of the drive-ins. There used to be a couple of them here in Artesia. And did you have some follow-up information on what we learned about drive-ins last week?
Well, I have some follow-up information on the non-drive-ins.
Ah, okay.
Because at the time, there was the Ocotillo Theater and the Land Sun Theater. Of course, that one was the Land of the Sun Theater.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that, so in the 50s, Artesia had 2 drive-ins and 2 regular theaters. But in the 40s, there were, of course, no drive-ins. But at one point, there was only one theater, the Ocotillo Theater. But briefly, there were others. Of course, the Land Sun was built in 1946. But across the street from the Ocotillo Theater was a little theater called the Valley Theater.
Okay.
At 317 Main Street.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that that one shut down in the early 40s. I'm not sure when. But before that, it was a location of a different theater that started really early in Artesia's history. 1910, it was the Air Dome Theater.
The Air Dome Theater. So was this a motion picture theater or a performance theater?
Well, both, actually. The early theaters of Artesia were dual purpose in that sense. But what was unique about it was that the Air Dome got that name because it was an open-air theater.
Really? In the downtown?
Yeah, it was, of course, surrounded by 2 large buildings on both sides, but there was not, in fact, a building itself there. There was an enclosed space where they kept the projector and all the and a safe for the films,
mm-hmm.
but it was open air. It was there wasn't a roof. At least not until the 20s, when they tore down the existing structure and built a proper theater there that eventually became the Valley Theater.
Wow. So kind of like setting up a movie in the Heritage Walkway today, the experience would have been similar to that in the Air Dome.
Precisely.
Interesting. But that later was covered and enclosed, and then it became the Valley Theater. And you said it kind of went out, you stopped seeing any references to it in the 40s.
Yes, after 1942.
Okay. I wonder why the number of theaters had declined in the 1940s. Would this have been tied to the effects of World War II?
Most likely, because when you think about it, they needed projectors for Army training, for training videos. So movie theaters probably were not able to get projectors. And I I can't imagine that there would have been a lot of people around watching movies if they were being drafted.
Right. Well, and it affected Hollywood, too. That kind of limited their production. And there were a lot of things that people gave up, conveniences that people gave up in order to support the war effort.
And a lot of Hollywood was switched from making movies of like just regular movies to making pro-war effort movies.
Right.
Of course, John Huston, he was a famous director, and he was brought in by the Army to make movies for the Army.
Now, is he the one that was at Midway and was filming at Midway when the initial attack took place? And I think he got injured in that attack.
I don't know. I don't recall reading that. I do know that he was over in Italy in 43, 44, and he made some very controversial movies. One of them focused on a battle that was just not very well planned by the United States Army, and then after the war he made a very controversial movie that was banned by the Army that explored PTSD with soldiers.
Wow.
Because the Army did not want to admit that soldiers were coming back with PTSD.
Which they were, and needed to be addressed. And so he probably felt obligated or wanted to do that for the soldiers that were dealing with that. So, interesting. And that was, you said Houston?
Yes, John Huston.
Okay, excellent. Hopefully I'm not confusing him with another director. Okay.
He's the one who directed Treasure of the Sierra Madre.
Gotcha. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, that kind of brings us with the movie theaters, and then now does this tie in with the this day in history event that you wanted to share with us?
No, not at all.
Oh, okay. So we're moving to a different area.
Yeah, a different area on the globe completely, in fact, and it's sort of tied in sideways. Because I noticed interesting, this day in history is coming up on Saturday. This day in history, the U.S. Navy bombarded the Japanese port of Shimonoseki on July 16th, 1863.
Okay.
Which, when you think about it, that's odd, unusual that during the Civil War the U.S. Navy was attacking Japan. But that in itself could be an entire radio program. But what caught my interest about that was it's an event that's so far away, U.S. military action so far away from the United States. Of course, it happened before Artesia started, so that made me wonder, for events that happened after Artesia was founded, what was the town's opinion on it?
Yeah.
So I looked through, I picked two events, the United States intervention in Nicaragua in 1912 and the occupation of Veracruz in 1914. Of course, both events involved a lot of sailors and Marines being landed on foreign soil. Nicaragua, that was, they landed in August 1912. They left in November. Over 2,000 sailors and Marines. They had 25 killed and injured. In Veracruz, that was over 6,000 Marines and sailors. Some intense fighting. Hundreds of Mexican soldiers and civilians died. But what was the view of it in Artesia? So I looked through the newspapers. And I checked 1912. There were two newspapers here, which should have been quite enlightening, because there was, of course, the Artesia Advocate, and that was a very prominently Democratic newspaper. And there's the Pecos Valley News, which was very prominently a Republican newspaper. And, of course, 1912, Taft was the president. So What did they say? What did they think about the United States interventions overseas?
Right.
And they said absolutely nothing.
So there was no editorial comment. There was any news coverage of these events, or
no, none whatsoever in the Artesia papers. Which, admittedly, they could get outside papers in Artesia. It's not like those two papers were the only sources of news. But the editorial content was really focused on the 1912 presidential election.
Mm-hmm.
And there's mentioning in the Pecos Valley News that they need to send more soldiers to Las Cruces because of the Mexican Revolution going on. But no mention whatsoever of Nicaragua. Meanwhile, in the Artesia Advocates, they were very... It's interesting. They could have used that as an argument for why they didn't like Taft, because they did bring up the fact that the Philippines' occupation and the war over there was really expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the Advocate considered it to be a waste of federal money. But they didn't use the occupation of Nicaragua as an attack against Taft.
Taft was a Democrat?
He was a Republican.
He was a Republican. And so they could have used it to attack the Republican candidate if they were Democrat leaning, but they chose not to do that. I wonder why. I mean, we don't know. Yeah.
At least the Advocate mentioned that Nicaragua was occupied. They had photos of rebels, as they called them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the photo captions mentions that United States naval officers are consider that the rebellion is in decline in November of 1912, but didn't mention the fact that they were Marines, United States Navy shore parties too over there.
Mm-hmm.
It's very weird.
Would there have been anybody from Artesia serving in those theaters? That'd be hard to know.
Indeed. I don't know to what extent I'd be able to find a sort of naval rosters.
Right. Only that if it was known that there were people serving, that might have spurred on some coverage. But that is interesting. So you've got these major events that are going on, and they're not getting any coverage at all in the local papers.
Yeah, and same for 1914. United States bombarded and then assaulted Veracruz, heavy casualties. And the first time it was even mentioned in the Advocate was 3 months after it started. There was an article that they clearly got from another newspaper that just mentioned close to the end that the United States won't leave Veracruz until there's stability. Which is odd.
Mm-hmm.
That there could be. But then again, looking through the 1914 Advocates, it started off April of 1914. It was just 4 pages.
The entire paper.
The entire paper.
Mm-hmm.
In years past, it was much larger. So from looking through it, it did not appear to be missing anything. But then as the summer went along, it started expanding. April, it was 4 pages. July, it was 8 pages. August, it was a very thick newspaper.
Wow.
It was weekly. It was weekly in 1912 and 1914.
Mm-hmm.
But it did not mention. It only mentioned Veracruz that one time, and then in subsequent articles there were a few mentions that the United States was still there, but beyond that, there was no mention in the editorials.
So it was like an event that happened, but we're just not going to talk about it.
That's the feeling I got.
Yeah.
Because the editorials range wildly in 1912 and 1914. And a lot of them, I'd say about 75% of them were focused on local and state matters. 25% of them were focused on national and international matters.
But not the military efforts in Veracruz or Nicaragua.
Precisely. But then in August, it did seem like I do admit that a lot of the coverage was probably ignored because there were other major events going on. Like 1912, there was the presidential election, and that was when Teddy Roosevelt decided to form a third party. And in 1914, of course, when World War I started, that's when the newspaper really expanded the number of pages.
Mm-hmm.
And there were articles about individual battles right after they occurred, updates on how many soldiers died. The Joyce Pruitt store started doing ads saying things like General Expense was killed, and so we have better prices.
So that's.
But
well, what were the in your mind? What were the significance? What was the significance of the Nicaraguan event or the Veracruz event as just far as United States history was concerned? What was the significance of those two events?
Well, the significance of those two, I think, really showed that the United States was changing from being a sort of locally focused to being internationally focused. Like, for example, Shimonoseki, they bombarded they bombarded the town because the town had fired cannons at American merchant ships passing by.
Mm-hmm.
So it was retaliation.
Right.
And then there was a massive retaliation campaign by the French and the British a few months later. But Nicaragua, they didn't pose a threat to the United States. The same with Veracruz.
Right. Not direct threats to the United States. That's correct.
So it was like the participation in World War I. It was the United States projecting power while trying to uphold values like democracy